very much for that. Frederick, it's interesting that some of the earlier talks talked about those incremental changes around things like genomics, etc. And yet when you look at the broader farming systems, the comment is more commonly around pursuit of those incremental changes. I think one of the perhaps concerning but sometimes overlooked aspects in all this is the human factor. The fact that people run agriculture, and there's some real concerns around both the availability of people to run agriculture but also the quality of those new entrants into the agricultural system, the extent of their education and knowledge. And so the person we asked to tackle this is Bill Bellotti, who's a professor at University of Western Sydney and has a whole range of other background and roles that make him eligible to talk to us about the human factor in all this and where the gains might be made there. So please welcome Bill.
Thanks very much, Mick, and thanks to the Farm Institute for this opportunity. There's so much happening in the agriculture education sector at the moment. It was a great, writing this paper was a great opportunity for me to broaden my understanding of all the things that are happening across the sector. And I'll touch upon that in a minute. The previous speakers have really illustrated, the breadth of education and research that is needed to underpin agriculture in plants, in animals, in the natural resource space, and as Peter just outlined, all of the exciting technology behind agriculture. And we can all imagine how much education is needed to produce people that can work and contribute to that overall challenge. But I'm going to put a slightly different spin on this. It's not inconsistent with what's gone before, but I think the productivity challenge really misses the point that the future is not just productivity, it's about this thing called sustainable intensification. And by that I mean what everyone's been talking about, but being explicit about it, we have to produce more from less. So we have to get this 2% increase in productivity, but the resources behind it that we traditionally put into agriculture are all in decline or getting more expensive. So land, we're getting less land, less water, energy costs are going up. So sustainable intensification is really what the challenge of the future is about. And that has profound implications for the type of education that we produce, the graduate attributes that are needed for this sustainable intensification are different to a simpler focus on productivity. So there's the outline of my talk. I'll briefly go through some of the whole range of activity by government and industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about supply and demand. This topic has been highlighted by the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture and particularly by Jim Prattley, who's sitting here in the audience. I'm going to talk a little bit about different views on what sort of education we need, what sort of graduates we need. And because I'm from the university sector, and particularly in a university where this is not academic but very real, this threat on the university system. So in the paper, I'm not going to talk much today about this, but in the paper I talk about the whole sector, so food and agriculture. It's the on-farm, but it's also the businesses that go into supporting it and the supply chain that comes out of it. So it's much bigger than the on-farm production. And I also want to include, it's not just production, but it's the interaction between agriculture and the environment and between agriculture and rural communities. So agriculture businesses have this unique place that, they're critical to management of natural resources. They're also critical for the future of rural communities. And we can't ignore those environmental and social aspects. And the education system itself is complex and large, so we've got school, we've got the vet sector, we've got the university sector, and increasingly we've got industry itself playing a role in education. So, as I said, there's a lot of things happening, and you really can say that government and industry really have got this high on their agenda at the moment. How do we provide a trained and educated workforce to meet the challenges of the food and agriculture sector. And the situation is pretty grim at the moment, as you can see. So we've had the Senate inquiry, came out middle of this year, and this report's all this stuff available on the internet. And also you can see all the submissions. There were something like 100 submissions, and also the interviews are available on Hansard. So you can get a very rich picture of what industry and academics and communities are thinking about this whole issue. In New South Wales, the state government recently announced this review and commissioned Jim Prattley to conduct the review, and Jim's busily going around stakeholders at the moment and due to report in June next year, I think. Industry's got in on it, and the National Farmers Federation has produced a draft blueprint, and it's out for consultation at the moment. And again, this is not just a farmer-driven view, but the whole sector, so the food and agriculture sector. And the federal government's got into the act in several different ways. They've got the food map. They've also got this thing called the National Food Plan. It's the first time Australia's attempted a national food plan. When I first joined UWS 4 years ago, we had a forum called Feeding Sydney, and I pointed out that if you look for food in the federal government, it's nowhere to be seen. It's hidden in different silos: agriculture, environment, communities, science, education. It was spread through many different agencies, something like 20 agencies. And I think it's good that the government is focusing on National Food Plan. Some people will dismiss it as just another talk fest, but I think it is a necessary and useful step. And if you look at this, you'll see, again, they're looking at food and agriculture and its links to communities, its links to the environment, and its links to health. Obvious links with agriculture, food, diet, and health. So what I'm doing is, I guess I'm painting a picture that agriculture can be seen as an activity on farm, but it can also be seen in this much bigger view. And science has got in the act as well. The Australian Chief Scientist has produced this study, Health of Australian Science, and he uses, Professor Chubb uses agricultural science as a case study to say, is it wise for a country to let its future strengths or needs be decided by school leavers? Because that's exactly what the federal government's put in place with a totally deregulated undergraduate system now. So students choose where they go. Universities just sit back and try and track them into different areas, but there's no quota system now. So our future is in the hand of our Year 12 students. The Prime Minister's Science and Engineering Innovation Council produced 2 reports, I think 2 years ago now, but this first one on food security, and again it points out the central role of agriculture in food security, but it's not just about agriculture productivity, it's about a lot of sociological aspects and economic aspects. So to be food secure, we need the food, but we also need to have access and be able to afford it. Another study by the same group looked at this nexus between energy, water and food. And so we can't have food security without water security. We can't have food security without energy security. So again, looking at the interactions between sectors that we've normally seen in isolation, we're starting to see the need to bring these together, to integrate. And this year also, the Business Higher Education Roundtable commissioned the Allen Consulting Group in a report that many of you will have seen called Rebuilding the Agricultural Workforce. I want to just highlight some of their recommendations with a report that was done 21 years ago by Nicole, which looked at agricultural education in Australia. So these are some of their recommendations. I want to draw your attention to the similarity between now and back then. So obviously we've got to promote career pathways to try and get people into agriculture, and similar recommendation back then. We have to get our course curriculum and so on, the design, to meet the needs of industry. And again, a similar finding back then. We have to get flexible in the way we deliver our academic programs to suit the needs of people that might be working. And again, similar back to recommendation back then. Education has to get much better at engaging with industry. So we have to get out of the ivory tower and see what industry actually wants. Similar finding back then. Get industry projects embedded into degree programs. Similar sorts of things. And rethink how we get students from school into university. Similar things back then. Now, I've just picked out the recommendations from both studies that were similar. There were many others that are different. But what it does highlight that we've seen this 2 decades, really, where there's a lot of agreement between these two studies, two very sort of comprehensive studies, but there's still a lack of will to implement some of these things. So there's a need for more political will, there's a need for more industry involvement and partnership, and everyone that looks at this whole sector makes this recommendation that we need greater coordination between all the players. So between government, between the different sectors in the education industry, and between industry itself. So some of these are motherhood statements, but really we don't want to be saying the same thing in 2033. And we really do need some action. I think there is some reason to be optimistic because of the high level of attention this has with government and the strong support from industry. So I am hopeful that through this round of reviews that we're seeing right now, that there will be some significant and lasting outcomes. The sort of figures on supply and demand that really triggered all this interest by government and industry, I'll just go through some of this now. This is from the chief scientist, and from 2002 to 2010, the decline in agricultural graduates over that time period. If we go back further in time, we started much higher. So this decline has been going on for many years, 20, 30 years. That's agriculture, and below that you can see the situation with horticulture and fisheries and forestry is not very good. The work of the Australian Council of Deans of Ag and Jim Prattley in particular has highlighted the large gap between the universities in Australia's supply and the agricultural sector's demand for graduates. So I think the figures that Jim sums this up with is that the industry is requiring 4,000 jobs per annum, and the sector is producing only 700 graduates. So there's 5 to 6 job vacancies for every graduate. And that sort of analysis, boiling it down to those simple figures, is the thing that's acted as a catalyst to get government attention and industry attention. We can't really go on like that for very long. What about the sort of graduate attributes that we need in our graduates? Are we meeting the needs of industry? University of Queensland recently did a survey of employers of ag graduates, and they came up with this list here of sorts of attributes that industry is looking for. So top of the list there is a practical understanding of products and production systems, and these sort of findings are quite common across a range of different surveys. Second, there is the enabling sciences, the things we've heard about from the crop science, the animal science, and even more basic, the chemistry, the biology, the mathematics. And then there's a whole range of sort of people skills that industry wants graduates that communicate. It's funny about that, and that can solve problems and can think critically. And undergraduate curriculum are trying to cram all these things into the curriculum in various ways to various levels of success. So what's happening now? This is a personal view of what's happening in universities, and I've been in the University of Adelaide for nearly 20 years and the University of Western Sydney for just 4 years. So what we've seen is a decline in student numbers, which flows through to a decline in academic numbers, because we're all under this sort of formula of bums on seats or equivalent full-time student units. And when you get too small, then the hierarchy up in the university says we need to get this small unit of academics, the old ag faculty, and it's being absorbed into a larger science faculty in general. And this has happened at many of Australia's agriculture universities. And with that, there's been another trend towards focusing on research and publications in high-quality journals. And this has led to research, high-level research in certain areas, and it's come at the expense of a focus on practical, applied knowledge. So academics are increasingly pushed to do science in a certain sort of field to be published in certain journals. And the university funding model that we operate under really only allows very large and generic undergraduate programs with 100 or more students in first year. Agricultural programs are often smaller than that and regarded as a niche specialist sort of program. They're struggling to survive in the current economic sort of climate. So all of that has worked against traditional agricultural programs. And universities, all of these forces are coming from different angles, and they're having implications for the sort of education we provide and the sort of graduates we produce. And what's driving the change is not concern over graduate attributes or learning outcomes. Now, we have universities being pulled in various directions. So, on the one hand, industry is saying we want work-ready graduates, we want skills and competency, which is usually delivered by the vet sector, usually regarded as training rather than education. And we want, as we saw in the UQ survey, practical knowledge of production and production systems. It's a sort of stereotype of industry view. But we have science pulling in a different direction. So there's this thing called positivism, which is a philosophy or an ethic of science. And it says scientists should be concerned only with designing experiments, collecting data, interpreting the data, but not getting too involved in saying, well, what are the wider implications and consequences of that technology. So we can have someone in Mark's lab, for example, working on a particular gene in a particular species that controls a certain membrane in a cell that affects salt tolerance. And that person will have potentially very little knowledge of farming systems and all the things that go into that. And positivism is aligned very closely with reductionism, where instead of studying farms as complex systems or even this bigger food supply system or the natural environment, the catchment, we're trying to reduce all of this into its component parts and study that in isolation. And in my own career, at that time at universities, I've seen a shift from animal husbandry to animal science, and a shift from agronomy, which is my base discipline, to plant science and even molecular plant science. So these are big mega trends about education and knowledge, and they have implications for education in agriculture particularly. And there's a third area which in my title I think is very important, is this need to produce graduates that can contribute to the future, where the future is more complex than it has been. And as an example of complexity, think of carbon farming. What does that mean? The future is more uncertain, and think of climate change. What is the climate going to be like? And the future is going to be contested. So instead of all being in one direction, so we're going to go for production, we have certain people saying, well, I'm not so sure production's the right thing. I think we need a more agrarian philosophy about agriculture, more local food. Maybe I don't want GM crops. Maybe I want less irrigation and more water to the environment. So things are contested. So all of that requires a different sort of education. People that can look at an integrated system to see the links between sectors and so on. And a sustainable education is becoming a term to describe a new way of educating people for this sort of, not just agriculture, but all of these endeavours where humanity is bumping up against limits in the environment. So, Mick, summing up, but I think I've got one slide after this. So, probably a key finding over recent years is this well-recognised gap between supply and demand. So 700 graduates per year and 4,000 jobs. That has got a lot of recognition and a lot of action, and it's galvanising action into how do we get more students into university agriculture programs. And I'd recommend people have a look at a website, a new website, which I think is available online now, called Career Harvest. It was developed by the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture. Career Harvest is designed targeting school leaders, and it's designed to open up their mind about all of the exciting career options within this food agriculture sector. And it's trying to get away from the stereotype that all the jobs are just on farm. So it's a pretty exciting website. But my second point here, and what I've tried to emphasise in my talk and in the paper, is this less well recognised or acknowledged and even not agreed that there are competing views about how we address future education needs. And I use the word needs in contrast to supply and demand. So over the next 20, 30 years, what are the needs of our agriculture graduates? And what sort of graduates do we need to go into this future, which is more complex, more uncertain and contested? And the challenge is really exemplified by the need for sustainable intensification. It really is the challenge that will define humanity over the next decades. And Mick, I'll finish with one terrible slide, which I failed my students because it's far too wordy. But this guy from University of Plymouth in the UK is one of the pioneers about education for sustainability. So what he's saying is sustainability is not just another issue to tack into the curriculum. It requires a different view of the curriculum altogether. The second point there is that we can see all around us examples of unsustainability. So soil degradation, groundwater depletion, climate change. So we know there are serious, massive issues to do with unsustainability. So how do we respond to that? And rather than seeing as how do we integrate sustainability into university education, this guy's quite profoundly saying, no, we've got to turn that around and we've got to make university education fit into sustainability. And that's sort of a big challenge for the future. I'll leave it at that.